Hello, everyone. We're going to get this webinar started. My name is Fitsum Aragai. I'm a community organizer with the African Caribbean Black Network of Waterloo Region and Ground UP Waterloo Region. And I'm an independent journalist and writer based in Kitchener, Ontario. So I'm going to kick things off with a land acknowledgement. I acknowledge that I live and work on this stolen and colonized Turtle Island. This theft is made possible through the enslavement of African peoples and anchored on the genocide of Indigenous peoples. This land is the traditional territory of the Chinatan, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. My home is situated on the Haldimand Tract, the land promised to Six Nations, which includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. As a Black person who lives in the wake of settler colonial violence, I stand in solidarity with Indigenous peoples in our collective commitment to ending systemic racism and achieving liberation for all our peoples. So what does that actually mean in action? How do we move land acknowledgements beyond just lip service? We have to be clear about our commitment to giving land back to Indigenous peoples. So think of your connection to capital. Are you connected to an organization with land, money, or fundraising capacity? Has your family had a conversation about generational wealth and reparations? Do you know Indigenous people in your community? I implore folks who live in Waterloo Region to look into the work and activism of Land Back Camp. You can Google them and find their website. You can make donations. You can support the work they do. I'd like to give a heartfelt thanks to the host of this event, Independent Jewish Voices, the Palestinian Youth Movement, and Ground UP Waterloo Region. I also want to thank our panelists for making time to speak at this webinar. Your expertise and your lived experiences are tremendously valued and appreciated, so thank you. We've come together this evening because of a motion that was introduced by trustees at the Waterloo Regional District School Board, and that motion was for the board to adopt the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's working definition of anti-Semitism. The International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance is also known as IHRA, or some people call it the IHRA. Certainly, there is a real need to address anti-Semitism in our region. There have been a few high-level incidences of anti-Semitism that have been in the news. One that comes to mind was back in October. That was vandalism that was left at the Beth Jacobs Synagogue. And then the same week, Guelph saw a couple incidents of anti-Semitism where swastikas were spray painted at the synagogue. These incidents keep happening over and over again, but are not reported in the media. What's concerning is that none of our elected officials at any level of government address these anti-Semitic attacks. That's not okay. This is precisely why we have partnered with Independent Jewish Voices. One of their guiding principles for addressing anti-Semitism is to not isolate anti-Semitism from other forms of oppression. My position as a Black man who navigates racism and anti-Blackness every day is that fighting anti-Semitism must be part of a collective struggle against all forms of oppression. So to explain what the IHRA definition is and why it falls short in its anti-racism, Dr. Greg Bird and Dr. Jasmine Zine are going to make some introductory remarks. So Dr. Greg Bird is an associate professor at Wilfrid Laurier University. His first book, Containing Community, won the Canadian Society for Continental Philosophy Annual Book Award in 2017. He's published several articles and chapters in English and Italian, including in international journals such as the European Journal of Social Theory, Configurations, Angelici, and Human Studies. He has published 2 co-edited books and 4 co-edited special journal issues. He has held visiting researcher positions in Rome, Pisa, and Naples in Italy. He is currently working on a forthcoming 450-page anthology in contemporary philosophy called Dispositive Cartography. And Dr. Jasmine Zine is a professor of sociology and religion and culture at Wilfrid Laurier University. She received her PhD in sociology and equity studies in education at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto, where she focused on anti-racism and anti-colonial studies. In the field of education, she has published books on Black youth and student disengagement, inclusive schooling, and Canadian Islamic schools. Currently, her focus is on Islamophobia studies. So Dr. Jasmine Zine and Dr. Greg Bird, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Fitsum. Is my screen sharing for everyone? You can see it? Okay. So thank you for the introduction, Fitsum. And we also just want to say a big, huge thank you to IJV for putting this on and all your help, for their comrades and friends in IJV. As always, it's amazing to work with you. to Palestinian Youth Movement. This has been great, and we thank you so much for your support in our campaign. And then also a very, very big thank you and shout out goes to Ground UP Waterloo. You've done some amazing work locally, and this has been great to work this campaign with you. So Dr. Zine and I tonight are just going to briefly introduce the IHRA, I want to call it IHRA, but IHRA, working definition of anti-Semitism. We'll just go through a couple of the brief points about it, and then we'll pass it on to our expert panel. Okay, so. So the IHRA definition, or the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism, the IHRA. So fighting anti-Semitism is necessary. Anti-Semitism is real and deadly. But many international Jewish scholars and organizations have argued that there are major issues with the definition itself. For one, and I'll show this in a second, it is vague and confusing. Two, it fails to identify anti-Semitism as a form of prejudice, instead calling it a certain perception of Jews. Three, it is not fit as a tool to adjudicate whether an incident is or is not anti-Semitic, and I'll explain in a second. It addresses anti-Semitism in isolation from other forms of racism and oppression. There's no intersectional analysis with it. And to many critics, it appears more concerned with shielding the state of Israel from criticism rather than addressing some of the key sources of anti-Semitism in our society, such as white nationalism and neo-Nazi movements. Okay, so just for everyone, just an introduction to the definition itself. Here is the 38-word definition of it. So it says anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed towards Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, towards Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. So this is the main definition itself. In and of itself, it's a bit short, but where the contention really comes with this definition is what are called the 11 illustrative examples of anti-Semitism. Critics have noted that most of the examples, 7 out of 11, are specifically targeted towards critiques of Israel. In particular, we have highlighted here probably the most contentious one on the slide. And critics note that what this particular illustrative example does, and if enshrined in law, is it's meant to protect and shield Israel from serious critiques coming from Palestinian movements. And so one of the critiques in particular that if you say it is anti-Semitic to claim that the state of Israel is a racist endeavor, what you're essentially saying is that it is anti-Semitic to make any claims about the state being an apartheid state and or a settler colonial state. And so this particular illustrative example, if put into law, is quite troubling and problematic. And there's several others, but our presenters tonight are going to get into this in detail, but I just wanted to show this now. So also, we'd like to point out that there are actually many competing definitions of anti-Semitism out there. One on the left-hand side of my screen here is from Independent Jewish Voices. I'll leave this for you to read. There's another one that's promoted by certain different organizations called the Jerusalem Declaration on, anti-Semitism. This is a direct response and critique of the IHRA definition. In particular, 200 of the world's leading Jewish and Holocaust studies scholars have written this one, and certain organizations are promoting that. Okay, so that's the basic introduction, but we've got an entire night ahead of us, but I just wanted to show you all of that stuff. So I'm going to pass it on to Dr. Zine here.
Thank you. And so we really want to appeal to educational stakeholders because we want to discuss the IHRA as it implicates educational contexts. And so it's important to understand and identify the fact that the IHRA definition was never designed or intended to be used as a code of conduct. And this was a point that was actually made by Kenneth Stern, who was one of the people involved in actually drafting the IHRA definition. And, you know, it's important that educators and other educational stakeholders give serious consideration to how the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism can impact students, educators, and schools. The definition is used by proponents to silence Palestinians, censor how Palestinians express their shared history, restrict academic freedom, and expressions of Palestinian solidarity. So if adopted, the IHRA definition will create a toxic environment in the Waterloo Region District School Board. It will undermine the board's mandate to provide a safe climate for all students, teachers, and staff. And it's important to recognize, you know, as we are trying to combat one form of oppression, it should not mean reinscribing another form of oppression. So Palestinian community members and their supporters have a right to participate in our institutions without being subjected to anti-Palestinian racism. I'm just going to give you another example if we move to the next slide that's more specific in terms of the implications of the IHRA, particularly on the equity commitments and mandates within the Waterloo Region District School Board. And these are mandates that most school boards have in some form. But specifically, the Waterloo Region District School Board's equity commitments include among them, quote, the aim is to foster an anti-oppressive, anti-racist, and inclusive culture at the Waterloo Region District School Board, where all students feel seen, heard, respected, and all have the support and resources they need to flourish. To do this, processes of exclusion will continue to be examined and reconciled. And together, through staff and community collaborations, gaps mitigated, strengths bolstered, and collective knowledge increased. So when we look at this commitment of the school board, it's important now to consider how the IHRA undermines these aims. So for example, we need to understand that anti-racist and decolonial education must be extended to include Palestinians, who on an ongoing basis are being dispossessed of their land, subjected to racist laws, and forced to live under oppressive conditions broadly recognized as settler colonialism and apartheid. And this recognition is necessary for an anti-oppressive, anti-racist, and inclusive culture to thrive in schools. And this is something that the IHRA definition would hinder and silence. By deeming anti-racist critique of Israel as anti-Semitic, the IHRA silences the experience of racialized Palestinian students and teachers who want to educate people about their struggles and as an oppressed indigenous community. They will not be seen, heard, and respected if the IHRA is adopted, and systemic processes of exclusion will come into effect. So referencing back to the equity commitments here, and that will be undermined if the IHRA is adopted. And this leads to a chilly climate of and censorship that's created as a result of the IHRA, and that will inhibit the growth of collective knowledge, again, that's framed in the equity commitments, and it effectively stifles social justice education. So these are some of the concerns that speak directly to the equity commitments that the board upholds. So in the next slide, we want to just give you a cautionary tale for schools. And this is a situation where a TDSB teacher and equity coordinator, Javier Davila, was the target of a politically motivated campaign to censor speech on Palestinian human rights. In 2021, Davila shared anti-oppression materials with a focus on Palestine to other teachers, through an opt-in listserv. And for this, he was repeatedly attacked by a Toronto Sun columnist and by pro-Israel groups who called for him to be fired and referred to the educational resources he shared as terrorist materials. Now, to punish and censor an anti-racist educator for sharing Palestinian perspectives on the oppression they face is problematic and counterproductive to anti-racism and anti-oppression education. So this is a cautionary tale of the chilling effect and the possibility that incidents like this will create increasing self-censorship among educators who seek to do social justice work. Next slide. This Davila's case was covered by the Washington Post, and that's just an example of how issues like this become, taken up very broadly as sites of concern. And in the Washington Post, they said that they concluded that, quote, today we're in the midst of a shift in discourse as more and more of us recognize oppression and settler colonial violence. And as we mainstream the need to remedy historical injustice and prevent future transgressions. Educators are on the front lines of this moral awakening, and they ought to not only impart critical thinking skills to those they educate, but also a commitment to justice and solidarity. And I know that what this quote states and the commitments within it are commitments that school boards have made across this country in recognizing the importance of anti-oppression and social justice as a core mandate within education. So moving to the next slide, I just want to also alert everyone to the campaign within the university sector that was undertaken by the Academic Alliance Against Anti-Semitism, Racism, Colonialism, and Censorship in Canada, or ARC, and Independent Jewish Voices, where 40 universities across this country rejected adopting the IHRA definition and passed motions against it, as well as the Canadian Association of University Teachers, which is an organization representing 125 universities in Canada, also rejected adopting the IHRA definition because they acknowledged that the IHRA definition poses a serious threat to academic freedom and intersectional, anti-racist, and decolonial initiatives across educational institutions, and warned that if governments and universities adopt the definition, there will be consequences for scholarship in Canada, including research funding cuts, outside political influence, censorship, harassment, defamation, and intimidation. And I can tell you that those of us who are academics, scholars on this panel have all faced these consequences.
Okay, thanks, Jasmine. It's Dr. Zine. So Dr. Zine and myself, Greg Bird, Mark Ayyash, who's one of our panelists, and Sheryl Nestel, we're four of the 5 national coordinators for ARC, the Academic Alliance Against Anti-Semitism, Racism, Colonialism, and Censorship in Canada. So our campaign has been quite successful at the university level. The Canadian Association of University Teachers has passed a no IHRA motion. It was unanimously adopted by all of their national council representatives, the Ontario Coalition of University Federation, faculty associations, 40 other faculty associations, and more recently, the University of Toronto has rejected the IHRA. And as far as we're aware, no university has officially adopted the IHRA definition. I just wanted to show one more slide, then we're going to move on. So this is something, though, that should be of concern to the Ontario Secondary School Teachers Federation, the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario, and even the Waterloo Region Labor Council. Many local unions have already passed no IHRA motions, including the Wilfrid Laurier University Association, Faculty Association, and 2 unions on the University of Waterloo campus, CUPE Ontario and CUP-W, and several others, as you can see on the screen. But we're going to leave our presentation up there and move on to the rest of our panelists. So I'm going to stop sharing everyone here.
Thank you, Dr. Greg Bird and Dr. Jasmine Zine, for that introduction. So for this next part of the webinar, we're going to have our panelists speak. And so I'm going to introduce each panelist one by one. And the first person we're starting off with is Sheryl Nestel, who's going to speak, give a brief background on the formation of the IHRA and the unveiling the Chile climate report, of which she was an author. So Sheryl Nestel has been active in work for Palestinian human rights for more than 5 decades. She lived in Israel, Palestine between 1973 and 1988. She holds a PhD from OISE, U of T, where she taught sociology and equity studies from 2000 to 2012. She's the author of numerous referee journal articles, book chapters, and reports on race and racism in the health professions, and the author of Obstructed Labor, Race and Gender in the Reemergence of Midwifery. Winner of the Canadian Women's Studies Annual Book Prize for 2007. She recently stepped down after 11 years on the steering committee of Independent Jewish Voices Canada, where she was instrumental in launching IJV's highly respected campaign against the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism. She recently completed a groundbreaking research project written by Rowan Goddett, which surveyed the impact of harassment, intimidation, and the suppression of speech on Palestine on 77 academics and activists in Canada. Sheryl, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Fitzim. And, thank you, Dr. Bird and Dr. Zine, for setting this up so beautifully. What I want to bring forward today in this webinar is that despite the claims to the contrary, the IHRA is decidedly not a universally accepted definition of anti-Semitism. I think this is something that a lot of those who are asked to consider it do not understand. In other words, how contentious this definition has become. It's been vigorously opposed by leading Jewish and non-Jewish academics, by civic organizations, and even by the definition's lead author himself, as was mentioned earlier. And despite claims that Jews unanimously support the IHRA, the debate within the Jewish community has actually been quite an intense one. Who legitimately speaks for Jews is definitely up for debate. Moreover, the voices of Palestinians who stand to be directly affected by the prohibitions contained in the IHRA have been excluded from the conversation. So a few points that I want to make here. The origins of the IHRA are murky and not well understood. Criticisms of the definition as highly flawed and dangerous to academic freedom and freedom of speech have been voiced widely in academia worldwide. 3, despite claims by its supporters that it is not an impediment to free speech, the IHRA has indeed been used to censure speech critical of Israel, both in Canada and around the world. There are more than 50 examples of how the IHRA has been used to silence critics of Israel worldwide, and these include firings, cancellation of pro-Palestine events and speakers, and closing the organizational bank accounts. And these are just the public ones. There are many, many incidents and trends that I'll talk about in a minute in terms of our Chile climate report. So I suggest if you want to know more about this, excuse me, you can check out IJV's website, which has an IHRA section, and also the Foundation for Middle East Peace, which has an extensive documentation of issues related to the IHRA. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the origins of the IHRA, which I think are very, very poorly understood. It has its roots in a working definition of anti-Semitism that was first published by the European Monitoring Center on Racism and Xenophobia. And it was based on work done in between 2003 and 2005. And the purpose of this definition was to provide a common set of guidelines for researchers, agencies, and governments that were monitoring incidents of anti-Semitism in Europe. And it was meant primarily as a discussion paper and an ad hoc guide to researchers and statisticians. And its goal was to provide everybody who had been monitoring anti-Semitism with a consensus document on how to identify anti-Semitic incidents. So on January 28, 2005, the European Monitoring Center, which was an autonomous agency of the European Union, published on its website a draft working definition of anti-Semitism. It proved controversial. And by 2013, it had been abandoned by the EUMC's successor body, the Fundamental Rights Agency. And then kind of all of a sudden, on May 26th, the 31 member countries of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance adopted a variant of the EUMC document, subsequently, which became known as the IHRA Working Definition of Anti-Semitism. As Oxford philosopher Brian Klug has pointed out, and then there's the name. European Monitoring Center on Racism and Xenophobia lacks the pizzazz of the name International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. The name's the thing in this instance. It's almost as if rejecting the IHRA definition were tantamount to denying the Holocaust. Not that anyone would come out and say this or even exactly think it, but that nonetheless is the rhetoric of the name. So despite claims made by its proponents, the IHRA WDA was principally drafted and negotiated by pro-Israel advocacy groups, not scholars of Jewish history or anti-Semitism. And this is one of the misleading statements that gets made by proponents. The initial drafting and negotiating of the IHRA was led by the American Jewish Committee. And from 2014 to 2016, Mark Weitzman of the Simon Wiesenthal Center, which has just finished building a museum on a Muslim cemetery in Jerusalem, engineered its adoption by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. So both the American Jewish Congress and Simon Wiesenthal Center are interested partisan organizations who engage in blanket pro-Israel advocacy. And as if it weren't enough, the Israeli government has been absolutely central in promoting the definition through funding, conferences, and lobbying efforts. And as was mentioned, Kenneth Stern, one of the authors of the IHRA, stated that it was never intended as a tool to target or chill speech. And Stern has objected to what he has called the weaponizing of the definition, arguing that its misuse undermines efforts to detect and combat real instances of anti-Semitism. As a result, Stern has opposed attempts to enact legislation that incorporates the IHRA definition, including the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which was introduced to Congress in 2018. And just as an aside, there are a number of states in the United States who are attempting to encode the IHRA into state law. And again, you'll find that on the Foundation for Middle East Peace website if you're interested. So there's also something new has arisen in the last year. There has been a debate about whether or not, and one of the big controversies was whether or not that list of examples, and some of them were given to you in the previous presentation, whether those should be included or whether the short definition should stand on its own. So according to a recent PhD dissertation by Jamie Stern Weiner of Oxford University, supporters of the examples have misrepresented their status in respect of the IHRA definition. So IHRA member countries were able to reach consensus, Stein-Werner found out, only by excluding these examples from the working definition. The examples supporters have falsely claimed that there was a consensus for including them. So in May 2018, the IHRA's Committee on Anti-Semitism and Holocaust Denial unilaterally proclaimed that the definition and the examples constituted the full definition and that the subject was not open to further discussion. So this was prompted by the same Mark Weitzman, its former chair, and the Simon Wiesenthal Center's Director of Government Affairs. But as Weiner has argued, the Anti-Semitism Committee had and has no authority to rewrite or override a decision of the IHRA plenary, while the IHRA plenary has neither revisited nor revised its 2016 decision. So in a few short years, by rebranding itself and changing the order of its examples, the IHRA has gone from being an obscure document known to few people to a game-changing instrument of policy and an effective tool of censorship that functions in many contexts like a piece of legislation, with major implications for discussions of Israeli politics. So there's ample evidence that the IHRA is being used to impede freedom and has been used to impede freedom of expression, despite claims to the contrary, that it is not intended to do this. In the UK, the government in 2020 told all universities that they must adopt the IHRA or lose funding. They don't seem to have implemented this, although many universities in the UK have adopted the IHRA. Facebook was lobbied to employ the IHRA in vetting posts for anti-Semitism, and there's a recent Twitter appeal to Twitter, to Elon Musk, to also implement the IHRA definition in terms of Twitter, signed by I think 185 organizations. So it definitely is being, there are attempts to use it to shut down speech critical of Israel. Germany has been one of the most egregious locations for implementing the IHRA as a tool for identifying anti-Semitism, and has shut down numerous instances of repression and speech and legal liability for criticism of Israel in Germany. Back home where we are, in November 2021, the Ontario Court of Justice released its decision R versus 240479 Ontario Limited, This case is the first of 4 pieces of litigation against a Toronto catering business known as Food Vendors for alleged anti-Semitism. All 4 of the cases will rely on the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition of anti-Semitism to argue that legally opposition to Zionism is a form of anti-Semitism prohibited by law. And we're all tuned, we will be tuned to see what the outcomes of those cases were. So to the report, recently Independent Jewish Voices issued a 100-page research report entitled Unveiling the Chilly Climate, the Suppression of Speech on Palestine in Canada, and I'm one of the co-authors. Over 80 students, professors, and activists from 21 universities in 7 provinces testified about their experiences of being silenced for criticism of Israel. These are some of the themes that we documented: political intervention into hiring, restrictions on academic freedom, self-censorship in relation to Palestine, fear of the potential impact of the IHRA, even though it hadn't been implemented on any of the campuses, people actually behaved in ways that demonstrated that they were fearful of the possible implementation. Harassment by pro-Israel advocacy groups and media outlets, attacks from academic colleagues, frequent incidents of harassment against racialized individuals, negative emotional impact of self-censorship, harassment and suppression of speech, political interference by university administration, classroom and social media surveillance, sexist and homophobic slurs against advocates for Palestine, anti-Palestinian and anti-Arab racism and Islamophobia, and threats of violence, including death threats and threats of sexual violence. We are already seeing evidence of an environment where pro-Palestine speech and scholarship is under serious threat. And I think it's safe to say that the adoption of the IHRA and its implementation will only accelerate and exacerbate the suppression of speech on Palestine that is already distressingly apparent. So who's pushing for the adoption of the IHRA? Most of the Canadian organizations that are promoting the adoption of the IHRA are also at the forefront of promoting and defending Israel. The IHRA gives pro-Israel lobby groups a tool to persuade government and other institutions to clamp down on criticism of Israel at a time when there is increasing recognition of Israel as a practitioner of apartheid and a purveyor of unconscionable violence against Palestinians. Moreover, the claims that IHRA is a consensus document and that the Jewish community demands its adoption, it's persuasive, but has little basis in reality. Groups claiming to represent Jews are not democratically chosen bodies. Moreover, they mostly represent a donor elite that has come to dominate Canadian Jewish politics. Their Israel right or wrong stance is not shared by at least 1/3 of Canadian Jews, if not more, according to evidence from the 2017 survey that Independent Jewish Voices did, and a 2018 Environics poll conducted by the Jewish community itself. And with the installation of a racist ultra-right government in Israel, I think we can expect to see Jewish support slip even further. So the IHRA was adopted by the federal government without consulting anyone but pro-Israel organizations like CIJA and B'nai B'rith. No scholars who might have commented independently, unions or other groups like Palestinians that might be affected by or are opposed to the IHRA were allowed to speak at the Anti-Semitism Summit held in 2021. Who opposes the IHRA? Academics worldwide have warned that the IHRA is an attack on academic freedom. Last year, as was mentioned, the Jerusalem Declaration was published. It was said that it had 200 signatories, but is actually signed by 350 of the world's most eminent Jewish studies, anti-Semitism, and Holocaust scholars. Civil liberties groups in Canada, the British Columbia Civil Liberties Association, the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group, the Ligue des Droits de Libertés, they've all taken strong position against the adoption of the IHRA definition. In the US, this list includes the American Civil Liberties Union, the Center for Constitutional Rights, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, the National Lawyers League, and Palestine Guild and Palestine Legal. The editorial boards of the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, and the Washington Post have all criticized adoption of the definition. And importantly, many Jewish groups have issued statements rejecting the IHRA, including the New Israel Fund, J Street, Reconstructionist Judaism, Americans for Peace Now, and the rabbinical human rights group Truah. And Reform Judaism, the major denomination in the US, rejects adopting the IHRA for legal purposes. I sincerely hope that those listening who are charged with deciding whether the Waterloo District School Board will adopt the IHRA will use the information we presented to make a principled decision based not on obfuscating and manipulative pleas and arguments that claim that the IHRA is somehow a magic bullet to eradicate anti-Semitism, but rather on the overwhelming evidence that the IHRA is not only not a cure-all for all anti-Jewish racism, but a tool that can negatively impact students, teachers, and all those who value free public debate and support human rights across the board.
Thank you, Sheryl, for that incisive information about the IHRA and that it's not universally accepted and all the problems therein. So I'd like to invite our next panelists to speak on the student experience and share student testimonies of Palestinian students. So Shatha AbuAhmad is a student and a Palestinian organizer with the Palestinian Youth Movement. She's a refugee from the Nakba in 1948 and organizes to one day return to Palestine and see the liberation of her homeland. She works alongside young Palestinians in exile towards the same goal of justice and freedom. So Shatha, I invite you to speak, and I'm going to start sharing my screen so we can see your slides.
Thank you, Fitsum. Thank you, Sheryl and Greg and Professor Jasmine. So first, I want to start by thanking everyone for their time, to IJV, Palestinian Youth Movement, Ground Up, and for the opportunity to speak. So first, I'd like to introduce the Palestinian Youth Movement. We're a transnational, independent grassroots organization made up of young Palestinians in Palestine and in exile due to the colonization and occupation of our homeland. Our belonging to Palestine and our aspirations for justice and liberation is what motivate us as a younger generation to assume an active role in our national struggle for the liberation of our homeland, our people, and to ensure a better freedom and justice for the generations to come. So I want to do a little exercise with everyone. I want you all to imagine that you're a Palestinian student. You come into your first day of class and you introduce yourself. Hello, my name is so-and-so, and I'm a Palestinian refugee. Your teacher immediately reprimands you. You're not Palestinian, you're Jordanian, and don't ever repeat that in my class. Next day, you come in really excited, wearing your keffiyeh, a traditional Palestinian scarf, a piece of back home, and the teacher tells you, either you take off that terrorist scarf or you leave my class. Now, this isn't the first time you've heard that. You've become accustomed to the anti-Palestinian racism, so much so that if you Google, what does a terrorist wear, you'll see a keffiyeh come up. Now, you're in a different class. The topic is terrorism. You look up at the board and you see that the example given is a photo of Palestinians. I want you to sit with those moments and imagine how you'd feel. These, unfortunately, aren't made up scenarios. They're real instances, most of them having happened here in Ontario. Beyond the feeling of disenfranchisement, you're a refugee, as are the majority of Palestinians. That's constant. Beyond the feeling of alienation, the loneliness, maybe if you're really, really young, confused and hurt, the feeling that you're going to feel is unsafe. We don't need to look far to see how institutionalized anti-Palestinian racism is when just 2 months ago, the London, Ontario School Board, TVDSB, used the example of a shirt saying Free Palestine as school attire that would promote or incite violence. The call to free Palestine, to end the oppression of our people, our families, was vilified and to an extent criminalized. I don't think people who aren't Palestinian understand that this isn't an anomaly. It isn't a one-off thing. It's a small microcosm of a system, of an institution that has normalized this kind of dehumanization and has normalized this kind of discrimination. Now, that statement didn't come out of nowhere. There are protocols and meetings before these things go through. It's only a reflection of how rampant anti-Palestinian racism really is. As Palestinians, as Palestinian students, we weren't shocked. This is the same dehumanization and vilification that we are subjected to on a daily basis. Now, going back to that feeling of unsafety, It's very common for Palestinians not to feel safe enough to even mention the word Palestine, let alone mention that they are Palestinian, for fear of being penalized, ostracized, and harassed. I've spent the past 2 months collecting statements from Palestinian students on their experiences, and something I really want to emphasize is that this is the common experience of the average Palestinian student. So something that Palestinian students are regularly subjected to is doxing. It's a very common thing. If you're friends with a Palestinian or you're in Palestinian spaces, you know about this, where our personal information, our schools, our place of work, where we live, is put on the internet alongside a defamation campaign with the goal of having us expelled, fired from our jobs, blacklisted from future endeavors. And these harassment campaigns are consistent. They don't end until they've completely destroyed you. All for simply calling for freedom and justice for Palestinians, or daring to criticize Israel's brutal oppression of the Palestinian people. So I'm going to leave you with one experience of mine, something that, beyond the verbal and physical harassment, it was a personal experience that at the time, I think really, I don't have any other word, but broke something in me to describe it with, where I was talking to one of my professors, and I really, really looked up to this professor. I was talking to them about my master's, about my research, what I wanted to focus on, and he stopped me and told me, Shatha, I'm going to be very honest with you. You need to stop talking about Palestine if you want to ever dream of getting into a master's program. Don't mention it in your papers anymore. Distance yourself from it. Talk about the refugee crisis. Talk about the Middle East. Be very vague, but don't mention Palestine, or I can't help you. And at that moment, I think it really struck me how alone I was with a professor who I thought understood the struggle, who I thought supported me. And in that moment is when it really registered how people looked at Palestinians, or how people viewed Palestinian students. So a lot of people have asked me, then why do you continue to speak out? It's not worth it to go through all of this harassment, all of these doxing, all this intimidation. But my answer will be the same answer of every Palestinian. We owe it to our people to be a voice for the voiceless. Nothing that I'm subjected to here will mirror a fraction of what my people go back home. For me, I have family in Gaza, for example. Gaza is the world's largest open-air prison. It's been under a land, sea, and air siege for 15 years now. When Israel bombs them, they have nowhere to go. They're trapped. On the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people, just a couple days ago, 5 Palestinians were murdered. You're not going to see it on TV. It's not going to get reported on. Our lives don't mean anything in the international arena, and neither do our voices locally. So I want you to sit with your vote and really think about it. There are no mechanisms in place to protect Palestinian students. When you're in an environment where you're terrified to say where you're from, who you are, that's a problem. Thank you so much for your time. And I let the next speaker go through.
Thank you, Shatha, so much for your presentation and speaking directly to the impact this has on Palestinian students and people. So thank you. Next up, we have Melissa Pang, who's going to speak about the pedagogical issues with the IHRA definition. So Melissa Pang is a member of Independent Jewish Voices and an advocate for justice, peace, and human rights in Israel and Palestine. She works for the University of Toronto, where she currently serves on an EDI council and advises the university's leadership on her experiences as a Jewish and Malaysian Chinese Canadian. Melissa, I'll invite you to speak now.
Thank you so much. So yeah, as mentioned, I'm Melissa. I'm Jewish and Malaysian Chinese. I'm a member of Independent Jewish Voices, which represents many progressive Jewish people across Canada, including, of course, Waterloo Region. And I also, as mentioned, work for the University of Toronto, where in addition to contributing to our equity, diversity, and inclusion efforts, I also participated in the university's recent discussions about anti-Semitism and whether or not to adopt the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. So we just went through the same thing. And I'd like to share why, as a Jewish person, I believe it would be a mistake to adopt the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, and also why the University of Toronto decided not to adopt it. So the first problem is that many others have mentioned, the IHRA definition was never intended or designed to be used as a code of conduct or a policy. The creator of the IHRA definition is a Jewish man named Kenneth Stern, as others have mentioned, and he wrote the definition just for research use. In 2019, he wrote an article on The Guardian, you can look it up, saying it is not right to use this definition as a code of conduct in educational settings, and that in fact, he believes that right-wing pro-Israel groups are intentionally pushing and misusing his definition in order to shut down any criticism of Israel. So right away, if you're hoping that the IHRA definition will help you prevent or navigate possible incidents of anti-Semitism, it is really not written in a way that would help. Its language might sound kind of fine on the surface, but if you actually try to apply it to the kinds of real world situations that come up in our schools, you discover almost immediately that it has dangerously loose language around what is and isn't okay to say about the country of Israel. For example, it suggests that talking about Israel as systemically racist or a settler colonial state is the same as hating Jewish people. That's very extreme, but also how could talking about systemic racism and settler colonialism there be totally off the table for just one country? What if a student did experience systemic racism and settler colonialism there, or is writing an essay and wants to cite a report from the UN, which does exist, about apartheid conditions there? Should they be forbidden? And also, what about non-white Jewish students who have experienced these issues in Israel themselves? Is talking about it off the table for them too, because it means they hate themselves? And if it's not off the table for Jewish kids, what does it mean that a Jewish student can say something about a particular nation state, but the Palestinian student sitting right next to them would be barred for saying the exact same thing? That's a huge can of worms. The definition also suggests that you can't be more critical of Israel than other countries. In practice, that's like saying anytime a student says something critical of Canada, they have to say something just as critical about every other country just to cover themselves. Otherwise, they could be investigated for being disproportionately critical of Canada and therefore potentially hating Canadians. More broadly, how could students learn and talk about world issues or even family histories and life experiences when any critical observation or statement about Israel could bring down a whole anti-Semitism investigation on their head? And what are teachers supposed to do? Pull aside just the students of Palestinian heritage at the beginning of term and prep them on all the things they aren't allowed to say about a particular nation? How horrifying. In a school, that leads to so much more conflict and injustice, and it's just not practical. And that's one of the key reasons that the University of Toronto decided not to adopt the IHRA definition. As mentioned before by others, there are other definitions of anti-Semitism that are designed more for an educational setting and take a neutral stance on Israel. For example, one is called the Jerusalem Declaration, another is called the Nexus definition. They both have very clear practical examples of what is and isn't anti-Semitic to say about Israel, and they've really thought through what kinds of sticky situations might come up in an educational environment. For example, some students might have critical thoughts and statements about how Israel bombed their country, seized their homes, imprisoned their families, or violently forced them to come to Canada as a refugee. Of course, it's unfair to lump that child's criticism in with a neo-Nazi spray painting a swastika in the school bathroom, which is something that happened to me growing up in the Ontario school system. But the IHRA definition does not distinguish between those two contexts at all. Another problem, which I know Sheryl has also mentioned as well, is that Jewish people are not remotely in a place of agreement about what that definition says. For example, recent polling found that almost half of Canadian Jews believe that accusations of anti-Semitism are being used to silence criticism of Israel. 1 in 3 Canadian Jews think that the Palestinian call to boycott and sanction Israel is actually reasonable. The reality is, any definition of anti-Semitism you choose will be controversial and divisive within the Jewish community and even the wider community. That's also a key reason that the University of Toronto, after consulting with the Jewish community, decided not to adopt any special definition of anti-Semitism, and instead just handle allegations of anti-Semitism on a thoughtful case-by-case basis, informed by their own human rights code and protocols, just like they do with all other forms of discrimination. I also just personally believe it's really important for young people to learn to discuss any nation in a critical way. Every nation in the world has some human and civil rights issues, but the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism makes people, and I have to say even Jewish people like myself, nervous to say anything critical of Israel. But I think being able to think and speak critically about how a nation came to be, what actions its government and military take, and how it treats people, that's crucial for developing a mature understanding of the world. Now, I do know that for some of my fellow Jewish community members, that can feel like a threat, but I don't believe our sense of comfort should trump other people's rights to share their own stories and speak out against governments. If we're making everyone else feel like they can't speak out against a country, a political entity, without being investigated and censured, then to me that means as Jewish people, we have lost our way. As a Jewish person, I'm very concerned about the silencing and chilling impact that the IHRA definition will have on Arab and Palestinian students who we know have already been facing immense intimidation and discrimination. Arab and Palestinian voices, rights, and traumas matter just as much as mine, but the IHRA definition makes their rights and their academic freedom and perspectives matter less. And that's not a side effect, that is the whole point. It's why this particular definition is being pushed aggressively at every public institution by pro-Israel lobbyists who show no interest in any wider equity, diversity, or inclusion efforts, or any solidarity with other targeted groups in our community. So just in closing, I strongly recommend not adopting the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is a very real lived concern for me. I experienced it myself in the Ontario school system growing up, but the IHRA definition is not the right tool for fighting it. It will only create more conflict, more controversy, and more inequity. I want to thank you so much for listening. And also, if anyone would like to chat with me and learn more, you're welcome to reach out to Independent Jewish Voices, who can put you in touch with me. Thank you so much.
Melissa, thank you so much for speaking about these issues. And I know that educators are going to find what you talked about regarding the pedagogy around the definition really helpful and useful. So thank you so much. Our next panelist is Mark Mohamed Ayyash. Mark Ayyash was born and raised in Silwan Al-Quds before immigrating to Canada, where he is now a professor of sociology at Mount Royal University. He is the author of A Hermeneutics of Violence. He has published several articles on Palestine and Israel in journals such as the European Journal of International Relations, Comparative Studies of South Asia, Africa and the Middle East, and Critical Sociology. He's also the author of multiple book chapters and has written opinion pieces for Al Jazeera, The Baffler, Middle East Eye, Mondoweiss, The Breach, and Middle East Monitor. Dr. Ayyash, thank you so much for speaking, and going to pass the mic off to you.
Well, thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be on this esteemed panel. I hope the audience is learning and enjoying these presentations as much as I am. They certainly have all been fantastic and have set up the stage quite well for people to understand this issue. Let me focus a little bit here in my piece on anti-Palestinian racism. And I'll start with the definition of anti-Palestinian racism that we find in the report by the Arab Canadian Lawyers Association. So they define anti-Palestinian racism, and I quote, as a form of anti-Arab racism that silences, excludes, erases, stereotypes, defames, or dehumanizes Palestinians or their narratives, end of quote. And what is really critical from this definition and for all understandings of anti-Palestinian racism is that since the 1910s, going back that far, Palestinians have resisted the Zionist project and the Israeli state project to expel them from their land and dehumanize them, and have resisted it on the grounds of anti-racism and anti-colonialism. Those are not new terms to Palestinians and how Palestinians have understood their struggle and their plight and the experiences of violence that they have suffered from since the 1920s. And when you look at the IHRA, it is specifically designed to target that particular critique of Zionism in the Israeli state. I know Greg mentioned in his slides that one of the examples of the IHRA, casts as anti-Semitic anything that calls Israel in the Israeli project and the Zionist project a racist endeavor. That is I understand that for most people who are not that familiar with the history, they might not see this, but I can tell you from not just a person who lived under Israeli settler colonization for the first 14 years of my life and directly experienced Israeli dehumanization of Palestinians, but also as a scholar of Palestine and Israel, as a published scholar who has written multiple journal articles, book chapters, books, and opinion pieces. It's not a surprise to any of us looking at this definition that, or it's very clear to all of us looking at this definition that it directly targets the Palestinian critique of Israel and Zionism. Because like I said, from its very beginnings, Palestinians resisted the Israeli state project because it was racist and colonial, settler colonial. They used the language of anti-racism and anti-colonization, I'll repeat, from the 1910s onwards. So when we see these things like the IHRA, which is certainly not the first attempt to try to silence and censor Palestinian critiques of Israel, it doesn't come as a surprise to any of us who have directly experienced the violence of the Israeli state. Let me read to you a tweet that Sheryl mentioned before that all of these organizations had sent out a request for social media. It wasn't just, they may have flagged Elon Musk recently, but they've sent this out quite a while back across social media to censor Palestinian critiques and to adopt the IHRA. And they considered the following tweet from the Palestinian American scholar Noura Erakat, esteemed world-renowned scholar. They deemed this tweet to be anti-Semitic and in violation of the IHRA. So let me read it to you. She writes, she wrote this in 2020. As a settler colony, Israel has criminalized Palestinian life. You can go to jail for crossing the wrong street, driving on the wrong road, having a political thought, living with your fam, farming on your land, doing nothing at all under administrative detention. Your crime is to exist. This is actually factual. And for anyone to come out reading that, thinking that that is anti-Semitic, I am sorry, but you have entered the realm of lunacy. I'm a scholar. I'm not going to hold back or apologize for my honest pursuit of the truth. And I am going to call lunacy what it is when I see it. This is, look at all the examples that Shatha brought up in her excellent presentation. Just saying free Palestine, just saying I am a Palestinian refugee, wearing the keffiyeh or celebrating the keffiyeh. We're talking about very simple expressions of Palestinian identity, very simple expressions for Palestinian aspirations for liberation and freedom and human and political rights that are cast as anti-Semitic. I mean, it honestly should baffle all of us that this is actually a point of debate, that the IHRA has gotten us so far that we have to do these webinars this many times to oppose it. It should be really obvious. You know, one of the key sort of talking points of the IHRA that still, so I understand why some people get sort of stuck up on and are not sure how to respond to them. So I want to address one of the points that they raise, which is to say that no group, outside group, can tell an oppressed group how they understand and define their oppression. We hear this from proponents of the IHRA all the time. You can't tell us whether or not the IHRA is a good definition or not, because you're not Jewish, so how dare you critique this definition? And in fact, many proponents of the IHRA think that this whole webinar is anti-Semitic and in violation of the IHRA. The very idea of debating the IHRA for them is anti-Semitic. All on the basis of this idea that an oppressed group is the only group that should be asked how to describe their own oppression. Sounds good in principle, but it has one major flaw. Palestinians do not oppress Jews. Simple. The Palestinians do not oppress Israelis. If any scholar attempted to make that argument in a serious academic journal, they would be laughed at. That would literally be the response. Laughter and rejection, because it is a ludicrous idea. It is not supported by evidence, it is not supported by facts. So if you want to have an IHRA definition, fine, take out all the examples out. Take all the examples out and have that vague and weak definition that will do nothing to actually fight real anti-Semitism. I understand that, so that's why it should still not be adopted, but at least I wouldn't be telling you it's anti-Palestinian racism. Take all those examples out and stay with your vague and useless definition, okay. But the notion that only the Jewish community or the Israeli community gets to decide what is anti-Semitic on the question of Palestine and Israel, which are always connected, so they can't just say, well, we're talking about Israel. Well, if you're talking about Israel, you're talking about Palestine. You can't untangle the two. So the notion that they can actually make that argument on any sort of valid basis is false. Because once again, Palestinians are not the oppressors. Palestinians are the oppressed. It is clear as daylight. You don't have to be a scholar of the issue to understand that, but I can tell you that scholars of the issue generally agree on that. There is near consensus on this issue, as much as you can get in academia in terms of consensus. It's akin to climate change. It's akin to the consensus on climate change. Yeah, you might find me a couple of scholars that say otherwise, but they're like the climate change deniers in that debate. I urge you to not adopt this definition, because if you are sending a clear message to Palestinians, Jews, Black students, Indigenous students, Muslim students, all sorts of students who see the Palestinian struggle as a struggle for decolonial liberation, as an anti-racist struggle. It's not just Palestinians that see it this way. Talk to your racialized students. See how many of them contact me asking me to come and speak to their classes. They all see this as the anti-racist struggle that it is. And you know why? Because they are pursuing, they are on the road, on the path of an honest pursuit of truth. It's not, I mean, I would add justice, but if you're not going to be moved by justice or principle here, be at least moved by the honest pursuit of truth. Don't you want that in an educational institution? I mean, it baffles my mind that educational institutions continuously squirt around the question of the honest pursuit of truth. So all I ask you to do is follow the academic expertise here. That's what schools are also supposed to do. Of course, I support and I fully endorse the anti-racist and decolonial initiatives, and those should be pursued fully and comprehensively. But also add to that the honest pursuit of truth, and follow academic expertise on this issue, and understand that academics worldwide, including CAT, as was mentioned here, have rejected this definition because they can all see it for what it is: a propaganda tool to censor Palestinians, to erase the Palestinian experience of their suffering. That's what anti-Palestinian racism is. It tells Palestinians, no, you cannot name, let alone explain your own suffering and oppression. So if you don't want to say that, don't adopt the IHRA. Thank you.
Mark, thank you so much for that ardent explanation of anti-Palestinian racism. You connected a lot of dots from previous speakers, so thank you so much. Last, we have our last speaker, Rima Berns-McGowan, is the recovering former NDP MPP for Beaches East York. Before she was asked to run for the seat, she taught diaspora studies at the University of Toronto at Mississauga. She holds an MA in International Politics and Economics from the Johns Hopkins University and a PhD in International Politics from the University of Wales. Rima was born in South Africa of a mixed Jewish Cape-colored background and is a lifelong social justice advocate. She is proud of having held her ground in politics in the face of constant attempted silencing. As a progressive Jew who fought hard against anti-Semitism, anti-Black racism, and Islamophobia, as well as all other forms of bigotry, and for Palestinian human rights. Rima decided not to run again in 2022 and is writing a book on how to make politics less toxic. Rima, the floor is yours.
Thank you very, very much, Fitsum. Oh my goodness. What a powerful panel. It's such an honor to be here, speaking with all of these incredible speakers. And what I'm going to try to do is to just tie some threads together to punch out some things that you've already heard, but I want you to take them to heart as you consider whether or not to pass the IHRA definition, whether or not to pass this motion. What you've been hearing here tonight, and you've heard it so powerfully, is that if you want to fight anti-Semitism, and please do with everything you've got, fight anti-Semitism, this is not the definition to go with. What you've been hearing over and over and over again tonight is that this definition is a conflation of pro-Israel advocacy with anti-Semitism, and it is not the cleanest, smartest, or best tool to fight anti-Semitism. And I understand that for those of you who don't perhaps, who haven't until you watched this webinar tonight, been digging deep into what does it mean to fight anti-Semitism, which are the best definitions. I understand why it might make sense on the surface to pick up the tool that somebody wants to hand you, but you have to understand and you have to consider, what are the politics? Why is this happening? Why is it this tool that you've been asked to fight anti-Semitism with? Why is it the IHRA? Why isn't it the Jerusalem Declaration that you have heard tonight has been endorsed by 350, I believe was the number, and I'm sure counting, Jewish experts, scholars, who really know what they're talking about, folks who study anti-Semitism, the history of Jews, the Holocaust, who know what the best tools are. And they've said, all of them, that the IHRA is really problematic, that it is not a good tool, that it is vague, that it is confusing, that it is not actually about fighting anti-Semitism. Here's this other definition. After all of that, why have you not been handed the Jerusalem Declaration? Think about that, understand it. Something that nobody has mentioned here tonight, but I think is really important, is that one of the first politicians to really push the IHRA on American campuses was none other than Donald Trump, who a couple of weeks ago had dinner with a couple of vile anti-Semites. So yes, it is possible to push the IHRA and yet be extremely anti-Semitic and to hang out with anti-Semites who really want to do Jews harm. Think about this. Why did that happen? And I want you to really think, therefore, how problematic it would be to pass this particular definition. You've heard a number of times tonight about the way that Kenneth Stern, the lead drafter of the definition, has been opposed to its adoption. He wrote an article, in fact, in The Guardian in 2019 after Donald Trump insisted by executive order, passed an executive order insisting that IHRA be considered on American campuses when they deal with Title VI cases. And what Kenneth Stern wrote was, this order is an attack on academic freedom and free speech and will harm not only Palestinian advocates, but also Jewish students and faculty and the academy itself. And we have heard from Dr. Nestel exactly how it's done that. We have heard about that chill. We have heard from Sheryl and others how that chill is enacting. You heard the way that Shatha has had to deal with that from a professor. Kenneth Stern talks about the weaponization. He talks about what a problem that is. And he says explicitly, the real purpose of Trump's executive order isn't to tip the scales in a few Title VI cases, but rather the chilling effect. And I can tell you from my time at Queen's Park that that chilling effect is absolutely in effect. I was told multiple times not to talk about Palestinian human rights, not to talk, in fact, about what constitutes the best way of fighting anti-Semitism, and in fact, not to talk about the IHRA. And I want to put out there that I do believe that it is extremely anti-Semitic of non-Jews to tell Jews how to talk about anti-Semitism, including what tools to use and what not to use. I think that's really problematic. I want to point out as well that when the IHRA was brought to Queen's Park, to the Ontario legislature by Doug Ford's Conservatives, just for those of you who don't necessarily know, when a bill goes through the stages of becoming law, it is first read out, that's first reading, then there's a debate, second reading, then ordinarily it goes to committee, and that's where community members and groups get to discuss it and point out whether or not it's good legislation. And then it goes back for third reading. Well, what happened with the IHRA was that it became clear that it was going to be so contentious, and there were so many groups, including Jewish scholars, including Jewish community groups, who were going to come and say, please don't use this. If you want to fight anti-Semitism, and we need to fight anti-Semitism, this is not the tool to use. It became so clear that it was going to be so contentious, and it was actually going to hurt Ford, that he, in fact, pulled the whole process and passed it by order in council, thereby avoiding that conversation. But that conversation and that clear light of day is so important. And then finally, I want to say, with every ounce of being I have, that we will never defeat hate if we don't defeat it in all of its manifestations. We have to fight all of it. Hate is on the rise. Anti-Semitism is on the rise. It's terrifying. As somebody who grew up in Montreal and experienced, as light as my skin is, anti-Black racism as well as anti-Semitism, and it was virulent anti-Semitism, I'm terrified by what I see. I am terrified by the legitimization of anti-Semitism by such figures as the former president of the United States. And so we have to fight it, but we have to fight all of it. Time. We have to fight Islamophobia. We have to fight anti-Palestinian racism that you've heard described so well just now. And we have to fight anti-Black racism. We have to fight it all. This is not the tool that does that. And as educators, you need to take that to heart. Please, please do not pass this definition of anti-Semitism. Thank you so much.